Okay, gorgeous humans. Today we're looking at joint actions. These are the movements that your body can make around a joint or a series of joint. So first of all, let's look at the ankle joint. The movements that we can make are dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion, and eversion. Move on to the knee joint. The knee joint can do flexion and it can do extension. And now onto the hip joint. The hip joint can do flexion, it can do extension, it can create abduction, it can create adduction. It can also do internal rotation. It can also do external rotation. And lastly, it can circumduction. Let's look at the ankle joint and the movements at the ankle joint. Luckily for you today, I've cleaned my toenails and I've had a pedicure. So we can do dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion, and eversion of the ankle joint. So let's look at the ankle joint. I can do plantar flexion, so the toes are pointing down to the floor. I can do dorsiflexion, the toes, the ankle joint is coming up towards the head. I can do inversion, toes are coming inwards, and eversion, toes are going out. So plantar flexion, if I turn side on, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, inversion, eversion. Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, inversion, eversion. Okay, let's look at flexion, extension of the knee joint, flexion, extension at the hip joint, abduction, adduction at the hip joint, internal and external rotation of the hip joint, and circumduction at the hip joint. So if I turn side on, I can do flexion of the knee joint. I can do extension of the knee joint. Flexion, extension of the knee joint. Now I can do flexion and extension at the hip joint. Flexion at the hip joint, extension at the hip joint, flexion, extension. I can do abduction and adduction. Abduction at the hip joint, adduction at the hip joint. Abduction, adduction. I can do internal rotation, external rotation at the hip joint, and I can circumduction at the hip joint. So flexion, extension of the knee, flexion, extension at the hip, abduction, adduction, internal rotation, external rotation, and circumduction at the hip joint. Okay, you beautiful people, we've done the lower half of the body for joint actions. Now let's look at the upper body. We'll look at the spine, the shoulder, and the elbow joints. So if we look at the spine, the movements that we can do at the spine are flexion, extension, lateral flexion, medial extension, lateral rotation. Shut up. Okay, you gorgeous people, we have done the lower body joint actions now. Let's look at the upper body. Let's look at spine, shoulder, and elbow. So we look at the spine, the joint actions or the movements we can do on the spine are flexion, extension, their lateral flexion, lateral extension, their internal and external rotation, and also circumduction. Now I'm going to split the shoulder into two separate components. We've got the shoulder girdle and we've got the glenohumeral joint. Movements at the shoulder girdle are elevation, depression, retraction, retraction, and of the glenohumeral joint we've got abduction, adduction, horizontal flexion, horizontal extension, internal and external rotation, and circumduction. And then finishing off on the elbow joint, we've got flexion and extension. Now let's take a look at those upper body joint actions in movement. So at the spine, I can do flexion, I can do extension, I can do lateral flexion, lateral extension, I can do external rotation, I can do internal rotation, and I can do circumduction. Now let's look at the movements of the shoulder girdle. I can do elevation, I can do depression, I can do protraction, I can do retraction. Now onto the glenohumeral joint. I can do abduction, I can do adduction, I can do horizontal flexion, horizontal extension, I can do internal rotation, external rotation, and I can do circumduction. Let's finish off now with the elbow joint. I can do flexion, I can do extension. And one other you may need to know is in the hand, in the wrist joint is supination, palm facing upwards, and pronation. Supination, pronation. As always, leave me a comment if you need to ask any questions, or if you like the content, or if this is for your own fitness or for help for your level 2 gym instructor or your level 3 personal trainer. Subscribe for more.